Welcome to Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the StrategyCorp Institute of Public Policy and Economy. I'm your host, Mitch Davidson. Today, we're joined by Linda Franklin, the President and CEO of Colleges Ontario, which is the advocacy association for Ontario's 24 public colleges. In this role, Linda has focused provincial and national attention on the coming shortage of skilled workers and the importance of the college system in addressing this challenge. Notably, she created a marketing campaign highlighting the value of college education, and previously, she was the president of the Wine Council Ontario, the head of communications at Colleges and Physicians Ontario, and spent time as a political staffer, including a chief of staff to an Ontario cabinet minister. Linda, thanks for coming on the program today.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Mitch.
Yeah, not a problem. So, you're obviously on the program for a reason, and we should start with the disclaimer, which is we just released a paper last week about the role of colleges and the future of Ontario's workforce. So this started as sort of a future of work, innovation, automation type paper, and then COVID-19 happened, and we made some adaptation in the work between us to cover the happenings of the pandemic and what it might mean for the labor force. So full disclosure that was a commission paper where we did independent research as a firm, but Colleges Ontario posed the question: what does the future of work look like, and how can colleges adapt to be involved in that? So this podcast is going to talk about that paper, its findings, and just sort of break that conversation down in an easy to digest format. So Linda, I think the first question that we've got to ask on the paper is why the future of workers and why the paper right now?
Well, Mitch, a lot of people, as you know, have been talking about the future of work for some time, and it really has started with a discussion about automation and how it's going to displace people, and what do businesses do to adapt, and how can you be more innovative in this environment. And we just felt at colleges, because we train people to go into the workforce, that there wasn't enough focus on what actually happens to the individual worker in that scenario. What did they need to think about? How did they need to adapt? How do they find the tools to adapt and to know what to do? And then, of course, as you said, COVID-19 happened. And to me, that has made this conversation so much more urgent.
Yeah, and so the paper's got three parts, and I think it's important that we just kind of mention what they are off the top, and then we can talk about them a little bit more distinctly. So the first part is essentially what was happening in the past to Ontario's workers and labor force. And this has really been about the skills gap and some other things like that. Then it's why colleges were best positioned to help fix the problems. That's part two. And part three is, of course, recommendations to actually address these problems in the labor force. So I do want to talk about each of them individually. And what we found in doing the work, that it was really these mid-skilled jobs that were most at risk of automation, and the lower skilled jobs that were most at risk from COVID-19. So you had this kind of perfect storm where originally it was more your bookkeepers and your accountants and that sort of mid-skilled job. And now all of a sudden it was mid-skill and lower skilled jobs, your waiters and waitresses, your cashiers, those sorts of things. So did those findings surprise you at all? And in your mind, what would be the sort of main takeaway from that first part about what was happening to the labor force in Ontario?
Do you know what? They did surprise me, and yet they shouldn't have. I mean, I think we've always talked about the challenge for mid-level jobs from automation. And I mean, not just mid-level jobs, because, lots of professional jobs, accounting, pharmacy, are at risk of some level of automation. But the folks that we felt were most at risk of having to completely rethink their careers were people who were in these mid-skilled jobs. But you know what? We shouldn't have been surprised by this finding about the lower skilled jobs being lost to COVID, because as we know, COVID isn't really an economic crisis. It's a health crisis that's causing economic consequences. And so we probably shouldn't be surprised that right now the job losses involve high-touch, personalized sectors, hotels, servers, all the folks whose jobs we thought were actually pretty safe from automation, because they really were in, you needed that human touch in those jobs. And I think, to your point, what's the main takeaway? What does this tell us? I think what it tells us is we have to be so thoughtful about this whole area, because everybody's at risk. The world is changing, it's unpredictable, and I think COVID-19 has shown us that folks who we all thought were relatively safe and could sit back in the comfort of knowing their job would always not be affected by automation could well be at risk from very different circumstances.
Yeah, and I think, the interesting thing for me was that low-skilled position that you mentioned, because there was always a question, automation, obviously, if a business could automate their systems. They could become more efficient. They become more price competitive. They could produce more units faster, whatever it may be. But there was always this issue with lower skilled labor that the cost of automation was probably more than the cost of paying someone. And, you had this, I think of like a typical restaurant, the cost of, putting a system in where the plates are automatically, going out on a little rail to the customer. Like that just the whole premise of doing that doesn't make sense compared to having someone come in, pick up the plate and deliver it to the table. But now all of a sudden, those low skilled jobs have come under fire. Either they've been closed as a result of COVID-19 or the hours have been significantly reduced. So the challenge here, and I think this is the interesting part about where colleges fit in, is you've got two different levels of workers who are now displaced at the same time. It would have been one thing if it was just mid-skilled or just the lower skilled, but now you've got both sort of reevaluating and saying, what do I do? And that's where colleges come in. So I'm wondering if you can just talk to us a little bit about the role of colleges in tackling this sort of larger scale and complex economic challenge that is the future state of work right now.
Well, sure. And it's been interesting to me to watch this unfold, because I've often said to people, if the conservative government with Bill Davis as the education minister hadn't invented the colleges just over 50 years ago, they would have been trying to invent it now. This government would have had to have been thinking about this now. And the reason for our creation way back then, and the reason I think for our importance now, is that colleges were always meant to have a really clear line of sight on what do employers need, what do local economies need, how do we train people to fit the jobs that are important in the labor force right now. And the other piece was this idea of being able to pivot quickly. So just like we're seeing the need to sort of pivot right now because of where the economy is going, colleges were always designed to be able to address economic change quickly. So the structure of colleges means that we are driven by what employers tell us they need. We have program advisory committees that are full of employers that advise us on what curriculum should look like. But they also tell us when jobs are likely not to be important in their workplace anymore, and probably, programs that we were offering should be phased out, and telling us when new programs need to be developed and adapted for new needs in the workplace. And that kind of flexibility and responsiveness, I think, is critical in the time we're in right now.
Yeah, and the one thing that I thought was really interesting about the college system and its ability to tackle the challenge is the geographic location. So as a quick sort of aside, and obviously this is mentioned in the first few pages of the paper, but I was actually reading a book about the town of Janesville, Wisconsin, that lost its General Motors plant in the 2008 recession. And it's a town of something like 60,000 people, and they had almost 2,000 individuals who enrolled in college or tried to enroll in college because they were so everybody just went back and said, I need to go back to school in order to get a job, because all of the local employers, the General Motors plant and the feeder plants, were no longer employers anymore. So then the thing about that always struck me was it didn't matter if Madison, Wisconsin, or Milwaukee or something had the best institutions. They needed to be in Janesville for that particular example. It needed to be local and at home. And the colleges are in more than 200 of Ontario's 444 municipalities. So how important is that local presence to you and to the college system when dealing with these rapidly changing economic circumstances like we're in right now?
Well, it's so critical, Mitch, and from two perspectives. Certainly the one you raise about local economic circumstances changing. A lot of times, and certainly when GM found itself having to lay off workers, its first call was to the local college to help with retraining. And of course, a lot of these folks are mid-career. They have houses and mortgages and families. So they can't be, hundreds of kilometers away from their families while they retrain. So that local piece is so important. And, we've even, a few years ago when we had the double cohort go through Ontario, we had a big study done on why students go to college or university or don't go at all. And one of the key findings was, even for students who are coming direct from high school, students who were college bound would apply to 4 or 5 different programs at their local college rather than chase their preferred program across the country or even across the province. And what it said to us is a lot of people, particularly people who are interested in college educations, want to be local. Their peer group matters, their family matters, their community, they're grounded in their local community. So they need a place to study that's close, because their alternative isn't to go someplace else. It's probably not to go on and get post-secondary education at all. And, finally, on top of all of these factors, local economies need to keep their citizens at home and, to fill their own labor market needs. And so you really don't want people from all of the communities in Ontario going a far distance to study, because they may never come back. And so if you have a local employer that's looking for people to hire, and there's a local college who can deliver the education for that, and local students have access to it, the chances are you're going to keep those people in those local communities and keep far more of Ontario vibrant.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. I think the other thing that's really beneficial about the footprint is, as you kind of mentioned, that local economic need. So I think of something like, we had the CEO of Noront Mining Industries on the podcast a few months ago, and he talked a lot about how mining companies are actually moving to electric heavy equipment, and that's a new thing. Well, if you were the mechanic or the operator of the old equipment, you need to retrain and reskill, but you probably aren't going to go to a college in southwestern Ontario or downtown Toronto for that mining program, right? Or that
no, exactly.
You need to have that in your local community, because that's where not only the need is, the employer is, but that's likely where the student population is there. So, I think we've now, in the first half of this conversation, kind of framed the problem, right? Automation was going after sort of mid-level workers and middle skilled workers, and COVID-19 kind of came in and went after the lower skilled workers. So the paper has a challenge there, because it can't just say, here's the issues we're facing and call it a day, right? We had to put forward some solutions. And so the general thesis of the solutions we gave was that colleges need more autonomy over their course offerings to be able to adjust them quickly to meet those changing demands of the labor force and the changing demands of employers. And one of the main ways that we put forward was a recommendation on a system called micro-credentials. So plain and simple, before we get into that conversation, just want to ask you, what are micro-credentials and why are they the right path forward?
Sure. Well, micro-credentials have been talked about for a while, but now there's a really keen focus on them, because, as you point out in the paper, this is the moment where, if they were ever important, they're really important today and going forward. So they're basically a small portion of a traditional credential that you might get at a college, sometimes even a small portion of a course that you might get. And they're meant to be competency-based. So they're not meant to take a long time to get through. They're meant to teach you a series of skills that are in demand by industry, and finish that program and get you out working. And so the idea really is, as the labor market churns and changes, and as your skill set needs to evolve, micro-credentials can get you into a job, but they also can refresh what you already know about your own job and help you to stay relevant in that job as you go forward, without having to, quit your job and come back to college for 2 years or spend a lot of money and time retraining. They're meant to be much more responsive to the fast pace of economic change and the need of workers to get their training quickly.
Yeah, and I think it's that speed that's really attractive about them, right? You mentioned it earlier, be it a mortgage, children, maybe your spouse was laid off or is in a part-time employment situation or something like that. You can't afford to go to school for 4 years or even necessarily 2 years. You need something that gets you back into the labor market quickly, or you're going to have to make a lot of changes in your life. So, the nice thing about these micro-credentials is they seem to be a program that could be used by people who've been in the workforce for a decade or two already, people who hold a degree or diploma and maybe have only been in the workforce for a little while, or even by those who are on social assistance and are kind of looking to set themselves apart from other people and trying to find new employment. So when you're talking about micro-credentials and implementing them, because the theory of them is one thing, implementing them is another, what are the key things that government and colleges got to focus on to make sure they get right to implement these things properly?
Well, so, our minister, Ross Romano, has a phrase he likes to use, which I think is pretty critical to the design of these, which is stackable and trackable. So I think one of the things we really have to guard against is we don't really want to take folks who need a completely different look at how they manage their career, give them a couple of micro credentials that gets them a job with a local employer, but then they don't stack up to anything. So if your local employer leaves or the business shuts down, you don't want these employers or these workers stuck with a couple of micro credentials that can't get them into any other workplace. So the stackable idea is that you should be able to take micro credentials, and over a period of time, if you took a few each year or you took a few over a period of years, they should eventually be able to stack into a full credential, like a diploma or a degree, so that over time you would gain more and more education that would be portable for you over the course of your career. So that's really important. And the trackable piece is important too, because it means that somewhere there's a database that you have access to as the learner that is portable with you. So you can show employers what micro credentials you have. You can demonstrate what skills they've produced. And as you get more and more of these, you have a record that carries with you so that everybody knows what kind of skill sets you have and how close you are to reaching a full credential if you choose to. So those are the two most important things, I think. But I mean, in addition to that, of course, they have to be high quality, like any credential in the post-secondary system in Ontario. It has to be verifiable. So, you have to, an employer has to have some sense of certainty that these are delivered by a high quality institution and that they can rely on them when they're hiring you. And as I said before, they have to be attached to needs that are in demand in the local labor force.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. One of the things we heard when we were consulting employers for the paper was, hey, this program sounds great, but if I can't trust it or if I have a bad experience with it, I'm not going to hire people with that credential. So adding the college's name to it, knowing that they went through a verifiable institution, a Georgian college or a Sheridan or what have you, that gives employers the sort of trust that they need, that this is not just some gimmick or it's not a program where they didn't learn all of the core competencies that they needed to learn, right? So I think that part's really important. The other thing that was really interesting about them is they could be relatively affordable, right? And I think there's a conversation to be had about how government wants to assist students who are looking to get that sort of rapid retraining. But those programs, given they're only, 4 weeks or 8 weeks long, they're actually quite easy on the pocketbook compared to a lot of other university or college programs that might, as well as have longer time, have higher costs. So there really is sort of an attractiveness in a time where people don't have a lot of disposable income or a lot of disposable time to be able to do something like this.
And particularly, I was just going to say, the one scenario you point out, people who have just graduated. The other really interesting use of these micro credentials is, if you've just graduated, but you're struggling to find work and to find something where your skill set is a good match. There was a piece of research done that I saw at a conference last year where they basically looked at all sorts of jobs that were posted on platforms like Indeed and Glassdoor. And then they looked at people with generalized degrees and said, okay, if you were struggling, let's say with a psychology degree and struggling to find a place in the workforce, if you took one micro credential or a couple of micro credentials in an area that was in demand, like data analytics, the number of jobs listed that you would have been qualified to apply for went up in some cases by 100, 200,000. And if you got that job, the starting salary would have been $10,000 or $20,000 higher. So I think the other target it hits, Mitch, is this whole challenge that quite often young people graduate into the marketplace and can't easily find themselves and don't really know how to market the degree or the diploma they have to an employer that needs a specific skill set. And micro-credentials is a great way to fill that gap, especially for new graduates that really don't have money coming out of school.
Well, I like that you mentioned that because I think that's an easy, understandable concept on how to apply them. But what it also speaks to is, as part of the paper, we went and traveled to, I think, 14 different colleges and consulted them and their local employers that are part of those program advisory committees that you mentioned about what they think the future of the college system and the future of the labor force needs. And one of the things that kept coming up was this idea that you need more than just what the degree or diploma says, right? And so that could be micro credentials, which are, different verifiable skills that you have that will set you apart. But it also could be these softer skills, or what some people call human skills, things like problem solving, creative thinking, financial literacy, stuff that is less tangible and less direct, but very important to employers. Ability to work with customers. That's just not necessarily embedded in curriculums today. So what are your thoughts on those softer skills and how important it is to look at something like that in addition to just the harder skills that a micro-credential would offer?
Oh yeah, no question about it, Mitch. We've heard that too. And one of the things that we had heard from employers some time ago was also a concern about young people who, come out of school and maybe face a universe where they're still living in a gig economy. They still have to find the next job and then the next one and then the next one. And a lot of them are contract based. And they said to us, these young people really need to figure out how to be entrepreneurs. And, originally we thought, there it is again. Everybody has to start their own business. But in fact, what they meant was they have to figure out how to be entrepreneurial around their own career. How do I sell myself over and over again for new jobs and new assignments? How do I make sure that I'm the most marketable I can be? And to me, that also speaks to this area. If young people particularly have to find a new job every few months, every couple of years, if they change jobs more regularly than we ever did in our time, then I think a lot of these soft skills that could be achieved by micro-credentials are things like, learning how to run a small business, learning how to develop a budget, thinking about how to market not only your business, but yourself. There are lots of those soft skills that I think are going to be so relevant if our economy continues along the trajectory of more and more contract work.
Yeah, and I think we had a couple of recommendations that spoke to the need to incorporate that into sort of the you call it extracurricular programming or the electives, to make sure that students are graduating with that full breadth of understanding of the skills that they need and having a competency in all of them, be them harder skills or softer skills. The other thing that I just want to mention quickly, there was a recommendation in the paper about reevaluating the government's second career program, which is essentially a funding program to help people get retrained. And one of the reasons that I think, calling that program outdated is the fact that it says second career. I mean, what you just mentioned is exactly right. People are having 3, 4, 5, 6 careers in a lifetime. And so, just showing that the government's still thinking about, okay, you lost your first, but now we'll get you another one. People are already going into multiple different jobs over the course of a lifetime, and the college system and the education system more generally needs to be able to adapt to that.
Well, and that program, I think, Mitch, is a really good example of your point about speed, because second career required you to come out of the workforce. Well, and if you got laid off, you were already out of the workforce, but spend a considerable amount of time training, in some cases a couple of years. And it was well financed, so it's expensive for government. But even so, what we found is the number one path that people chose was truck driver. And for the most part, what they told us was they chose it because it was the fastest way to get back to work and start earning money again. So I think, to your point, the idea of using micro-credentials instead of these long-term retraining programs is pretty powerful when you see that people's behavior is motivated almost entirely by, I have a mortgage, I have kids. To your point earlier, I need to get back into the workforce quickly.
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, when we talk at the Institute about combining sort of policy advice with political understanding. And that's the political understanding right there, is that the reality to people on the ground is not, okay, yeah, I'll just go take 4 years because I lost my job to go into a new field. It's, I need to get back to work fast. My severance may only be a few weeks, if I even have one, all sorts of different life conditions that are occurring, and government can't just create a policy in a vacuum that's unaware of those realities for people. I do want to ask about a couple of the other things that were in the paper. So there were some other recommendations, because obviously there's still obviously a number of students who are graduating high school and going to post-secondary for the first time, and maybe they do still have time to go to post-secondary. They're not interested in 6-week programs. They need a more fulsome learning experience. So there were other recommendations about allowing 3-year degrees, removing the 4-year degree cap on colleges, and I just kind of wanted to talk about some of those other more longer term recommendations that focus on the suite of different diplomas and degree offerings at Ontario's colleges.
Sure. Well, and again, it's so clear to us, I think, Mitch, that with the economy moving faster, with change being almost a constant, post-secondary has to be way more nimble. And it's one of the reasons we'd like more capacity to, deliver degree programs and diploma programs that are relevant immediately in the local marketplace and be able to turn on a dime when things change. So, colleges are structured to be flexible, but I think this government has done a pretty darn good job of becoming faster and more nimble itself, looking at getting rid of red tape. But colleges often have to move in at the speed of business, not the speed of government. And so to give us more capacity to make good decisions in consultation with our local employers and execute on those decisions to create new credentials quickly, I think will be absolutely critical for young people coming into post-secondary for the first time and needing to make sure that they have the skills they need for the economy now and then in the future.
Yeah, and I think, the interesting part about the consultations and the work that we did was the recommendations really do run the gamut, right? They go all the way from like we started the conversation about people who've been laid off in the workforce and need to retrain, but also back to issues with students coming straight out of secondary school. And one of the things that we found in secondary school, or one of the issues in the secondary school system, was this perceived bias against colleges. Yeah. And we tried to look into why that might occur, and we found two reasons that I think listeners might find particularly interesting. The first was that once you get to senior level courses, they are academic and applied in grade 9 and grade 10 for students, but then when you're choosing, they're university and college in grade 11 and grade 12. And so that inherently, or at least in my opinion, forced students to think that universities were therefore automatically better than colleges. So that was one. And the other was a really interesting one, which was in order to become a guidance counselor in the province in the secondary school system, you have to go to teachers college. Teachers college is only available at university. And to get into a teachers college, you have to have a 4-year degree, which is available at colleges, but only to a certain extent, and more readily available at universities. So the amount of guidance counselors that have a college experience is probably even lower. So I'm just wondering about your views on that perceived bias is sort of against the college system, and if that's something that government should be looking at.
I think so. When I started in this job a decade ago, when we polled parents, they would say to us, well, colleges, great place to go. Apprenticeship, absolutely spot on. Lots of good jobs there. My kid's going to university, but everybody else should look at college. And, the transformation in the economy, really since 2007 on, now when we poll people, particularly parents, they say to us, I don't care what route my son or daughter takes to get there. I want them to end up with a good job that keeps them well connected to the labor market. So parents and students' attitudes about post-secondary have changed dramatically. And I'm not sure that's always true in the K-12 system. And you're right, I was listening to a radio program with an activist on the K-12 system a year or so ago who said no person going into high school should ever take an applied course because those are for students who will achieve less. I thought I was going to drive off the road because a lot of the programs that colleges teach require applied courses in high school. And the word applied, when you get into post-secondary and the workplace, is a word now that has real importance in the marketplace. It's well thought of. Applied education is considered to be very forward-looking, but in high school, it's still considered a negative. So I think there is work to be done there. And I think, frankly, there's work for the College of Teachers to do as well, because if we're now doing 2 years of training for our teachers, surely they could be trained about all the post-secondary options that will be available to their students when they graduate, including some knowledge about colleges.
Yeah, I think the point you made about parents just wanting their children to get a good job, right? To get an education that leads them into the workforce in a stable way. I mean, you've seen the government today is really moving towards that by pursuing strategic mandate agreements, which are really focused on tying funding to performance and mainly performance of graduates in the job market. But you also see students themselves are sort of voting with their feet on this issue. We found in the research that 18% of students already have a university education and then go into the college system to get something. And so
it's our single biggest growth area.
Right. And so maybe just speak a little bit as to why that is the single biggest growth area. It's that level of applied research that adds to the sort of foundational, more theoretical learning that they take in the university program, helps them in the labor force.
Well, sure. And it gives them sometimes a specific set of skills. The colleges have a whole range of options from 1-year certificates through to 2-year and 3-year and 4-year credentials that help you build a more specific set of skills that are more labor market friendly. So, I'm often reminded of my son who started with a university degree in philosophy. It was a wonderful 4 years for him. I would never have dissuaded him from going there because it was a clear passion that he had. But it's hard to graduate out of philosophy and find a job as a corporate philosopher. There just aren't that many of them around. And so he needed to go back to school and find a very specific skill set that would fit the demands of the marketplace. And I think we have a lot of young people in that position now, Mitch, whether it's because they have an interest in taking a particular program of study that may be a passion for them, but not translate easily into a job, or they've taken a course of study and over the course of time, either their interest has changed or the marketplace has changed, and they need to come back to college and get some specific skills that get them attached to the workforce. We're also finding, interestingly, that a lot of students that go through university and get a post-secondary credential come back into apprenticeship training because they find that they just want something that is, where they can see the fruit of their labor more quickly, where they can work in an applied environment. And for many of them, apprenticeship ends up being something they never thought of, but the right idea.
Yeah, and I think that just puts a nice bow on the conversation and on the paper, which is an emphasis on skills that are in demand in the economy and getting them to students in a faster and more approachable way. And the whole idea of university graduates coming back to college to get that applied skill in a shorter period of time is exactly that. So, we really do see a theme that was arising beforehand, and the changes coming with automation and the changes that hit us unexpectedly with COVID-19 have really accelerated that conversation. So, with that, I wanted to thank you for coming on the program and having this conversation. I think it's insightful, and it really adds a sort of a next level of depth to the paper, so people could truly understand the focus that Colleges Ontario was coming with when they asked that question and when we got together to produce this. And I'll also say, of course, you can find that paper online on our website at strategycorp.com/institute. So Linda, thanks for coming on the program, and a real pleasure to have this conversation today.
Well, thanks for me as well, Mitch.
Thank you for listening to Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the StrategyCorp Institute of Public Policy and Economy, produced by Sarah Bordeaux and myself. Views expressed during this podcast are not necessarily the views of StrategyCorp. All rights to this episode are reserved, and guests on the podcast may be current or past clients of StrategyCorp. To find out more about the Institute and to subscribe to our written material, or to find past episodes of the podcast, please visit our website at www.strategycorp.com/institute. Until next time, I'm Mitch Davidson.